Welcome to Digital Distortions, a podcast series by the ICT for Peace Foundation, looking at the role, reach, and relevance of disinformation and truth decay in today's global world and democracies. This podcast series is supported by the Daniel Gablinger Foundation. I'm your host, Sanjana Hattotuwa, a special advisor at the ICT for Peace Foundation. Hello and welcome to this episode of Digital Distortions, a podcast by the ICT for Peace Foundation that looks at disinformation, truth decay, and all of what is going on and wrong in the world today. And I speak to interesting guests from around the world who have something to say about that broad topic. And today I'm joined by Assistant Professor of Political Behaviour and Digital Media at the Department of Policy at the University of Zurich, Karsten Donnay, who's also part of the university's Digital Society Initiative. And Karsten and I have both known each other for a long time, and I've followed with great interest what Karsten continues to put up on that platform that was once called Twitter. That is very, very interesting related to his work. Karsten, we have lots to talk about, and thanks for joining the foundation and I on this podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me, Sanjana. I'm happy to be here, and of course, I'm always happy to support also the work of ICT for Peace.
That's very kind of you. Hey, listen, as one academic to another, the question always is, how do you communicate what you do to an audience that's not academics? And I know what you do, and I'm enthralled by it because it aligns with my interests as well. But I thought that the best way would be to, also a nice introduction actually, would be to kind of get you to talk about, for a lay audience, the audience of this podcast, what it is that you do, that's perhaps in a slightly more understandable form to what you put up on the web on your own website.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all as academics sort of have two hats on, right? We have the academic one, and then we have the one where we try to communicate what we learn to the general public and also to policymakers, which I find equally or even more challenging, perhaps. And I try different things. I mean, like you said, I have a professional website, but I also I'm regularly on radio in Switzerland, for example. I give interviews for the newspapers. We also try to put out products in a bit more understandable format on social media whenever we have current findings or interesting insights. But I've been trying to actually improve my own blog presence online to break down the things into a more understandable format. And so I guess today I can try to give the elevator pitch of what I do. My work focuses, broadly speaking, on the impact of digitalization on politics, and this is really as broad as it sounds. In the academic world, this also runs under the title of digital democracy. So anything digital about democracy. It doesn't necessarily just have to be about democracy. We also have some work about autocracy, how digital tools, digital suppression is used in autocratic settings. So I think I like this digital transformation of politics framework because that's really, we are in a digital transformation. We have been actually for quite a long time. Not everybody seems to be fully aware of how far it goes. So the things we try to do in our work is really to lay our finger on the big changes. So, how does our behavior change because of digital platforms? How does that then change how we inform ourselves about politics, also about society in general? How do we learn? Like, we have done a lot of work about the news. How do we perceive the news? Is there ways to get better access to the news than just reading a newspaper on any of these big platforms? What do the platforms do? How much does it change the way that we see the world? That's a big topic. Sort of this warped lens on reality that we're getting through being online. And then, I mean, the big part I've been working on for the last couple of years is sort of the flip side. So how can we then use these insights that we have to inform policy, also to feedback into society before things turn to policy? So also work with NGOs, trying to raise awareness for certain issues. Hate speech is a big topic we've been working on, and there we really went into the NGO direction. We directly worked with an NGO. We tried to generate visibility in Switzerland. It worked actually surprisingly well. Like, we got a lot of things done without actually things becoming law, because just the platforms, and especially the online media platforms, they just changed their practices because of the pressure that this project generated. And I mean, this is partially just our doing as academics. It's mostly the work of the NGO. So I think, yeah, we're trying to play different fields, sort of trying to push the academic knowledge, really doing also technically very sophisticated work where we collect a lot of data. We try to do experimental work where we are really manipulating platform characteristics so that we can really identify, okay, there is a causal relationship between things. And on the other hand, we're trying to do translation, which, as I said, works sometimes better and sometimes less good. I just recently had an interview with the Swiss national radio broadcaster for 20 years of Facebook. And the gist of this conversation was there's a lot of things we just really can't say. Like, we cannot say that there's no causal relationship or there is a causal relationship between certain things. He asked me, for example, about, like, does social media lead to polarization? It's a very hard question to answer. Like, is this a causal link, or is this, just happening in parallel? Or the same with, like, mental health, misinformation. How much really comes out of social media, and how much is also just the behavior of the people on these platforms, and how does this feedback work? And I think I still have my work cut out for me for the next years, maybe next decades, to try to disentangle some of those things.
Yeah, no, that's right, and that's fascinating. In such a broad scope of work as well. As you were speaking, I was going back in time to the time that I used cyber cafes in New Delhi as an undergraduate student decades ago. And of course, that culture doesn't exist anymore. A news platform called The Rest of the World, which deals with the global south, had this article recently about the height of cyber cafes and how it was not just the computer, but it was a place for teenagers to go and have dates in not so progressive cultures. It was a place where you went and had your own community, offline community, not just the online community. It was a place of gathering. And I remembered as an undergrad student at the University of Delhi how I used to go to the cyber cafe in a nearby market. And that was the way that I, had, and I think it was, it was like, it was 2 megabytes of storage for Yahoo, in its entirety. And I know it takes me back to the time that I started using computers in that way to keep in touch. And then, of course, India was going through its own liberalization at the period. And of course, if I look back now, you can see a lot of what has happened, gone on and wrong, and you can trace it back to that time. And the question I wanted to get at as you were speaking, reflecting on my own life, Carsten, is reflecting back on your own life there. In a sense, you are your own student, right? I mean, when you do this, there's a reflexive attitude that you sometimes consciously adopt, but at the other time, you think about what you're doing, and you're like, hey, this is very different to what I did. Or you sometimes have those flashbacks as well. Looking back at your own life, Carsten, how would you reflect on what you do today with respect to what you've done, in your adult life?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'm also from the generation that still had dial-up internet, so, like, really from the early days. And I didn't go to so many internet cafes. I grew up in a smaller place in Germany. There was not really one around the corner, but my father had very early had dial-up internet where you had to wait, and somebody was trying to use the phone, and everything just didn't work out anymore. But yeah, I think one thing that's fascinating is while you're in it, and I mean, I've been now academically in it for more than a decade, but also before, while you're in this process and sort of all this digital changes happening around it, you're pretty much not reflecting on this, right? It's just happening to you. And these things just pop up, and I mean, they're exciting, and you use them, and they start to permeate more and more of our lives. And by now, I mean, the work life, if I think back to even my times as a student to now, I mean, sure, we had laptops, but, like, the internet was not what it was today. What you said, just the social aspect of meeting, I mean, there was so much more offline contact happening. I think also the way that my students are now studying today has very little to do with how I learned. We had computers, but it was more, as a tool, more writing and sometimes research. We used much more books. We, talked, we discussed, and now it's very quick. The phone's always there. You can just quickly figure something out, go to your favorite search engine. And so I think in that way, yeah, I mean, it's very different what I'm thinking about today. And honestly, the problems that I've been thinking about maybe for the last 7 years, around misinformation, hate, and things like this is not necessarily I would have expected. My 20-year-old self would not have necessarily expected the internet to become such a nasty place, for example, like in terms of the way that people talk to each other, which is maybe it was naive. In retrospect, it makes perfect sense that people act out when there's no boundaries. And what I've become to realize now, actually, this is the a bit of the bigger focus now of the work I'm trying to do and where I'm going in the future, is reverse these dynamics a bit. Like, we've been just passive in all of this. We've just been letting things happen as individuals, but also as societies. And I mean, it's clear because the pace of change was so fast, and technological innovation is exciting and cool. But I think we need to really, now is the time to think about, okay, what do we really want? Like, do I want the internet to be nasty? Do I want big, mostly US based companies to dictate the way that we now socially interact online? Or is there a way that we actually can have a basic set of rules of things that we actually want of these platforms? And if they don't fulfill these, then those are not going to be our platforms, and we need to have other ones that are the way that we normatively want. So there's very little normative thinking happening in the tech industry, and also unfortunately not on the side of policymakers about what society and we and you actually want. We're just sort of trying to post hoc regulate the things that are just happening, and somebody's trying to earn money, and then this is never a good solution because it's always a quick fix to a much more fundamental problem. And I mean, one thing maybe we'll talk about today is like sort of this whole algorithmic component, like how the algorithms tend to promote maybe also sometimes the wrong content. That's something which is directly related to monetization, and that's a choice. We could make a different choice, and the platforms that we want could be different if we were going for different models. So this is fascinating for me, and I think there's very few people thinking about this in the academic
Yeah.
world. I know that some in the NGO world are more thinking about this, but generally as societies, we're not really in the driver's seat with the digital transformation, which is surprising because it's been happening for, I mean, almost 20 years, right? And we're still just running along with whatever the
Yeah.
industry is
Yeah.
pushing forward.
Yeah. No, I hear you, and I think that again, reflecting back, I saw a market change. If I now look back critically around not the introduction of Facebook, but the app, and not the introduction of Facebook as a platform, but the like button. And there were two moments in the context that I grew up in, where there was very clearly a Facebook before that and a Facebook after that. And just that one platform affordance and the availability of Facebook as an app. And of course, we are of a certain age and we can talk about these things. But I suppose it's also a problem of scholarship. When you come into this when you're younger, you don't understand, you've not lived through that. And I found it really interesting what you said about how we have operated on like an automaton in terms of society, where we allowed these things to happen. And it's interesting to hear you say that, because somebody like me would say that you had greater agency, you had greater power, in where you grew up in, and for a whole lot of other socio-political factors. But I can, on the podcast, this is also a video recording, I can see you nodding your head vigorously, in opposition to that statement. And would you talk a bit about that? Because there's this assumption that those growing up, where you did, and with your childhood where you were located at, had, as society, as a family, as an individual, as a student, as a person, as a man, as a father, as a citizen, a greater agency. But it doesn't seem to be the case.
No, I don't think so. So I think maybe there is shades, right? So I think obviously in the global north versus the global south, I think there is definitely differences. Also, just by looking at how the platforms think about it, they have prioritization. I mean, US first, and then sort of
Yeah.
other big economies that they care about second, and then maybe other smaller economies that they care less about third, if at all. So I think that exists as a dynamic, and I mean that's something where there's definitely some inequities also about how bad behavior is moderated, or how much the platforms are actually built for certain social contexts, or whether even there is content moderation teams to start with
At all.
for certain
Yeah.
things at
Yeah.
all. So I think that definitely exists, but beyond that, sort of just at the societal level, I think we were just as much exposed to just the things that these platforms were building. And I mean, now finally, regulators and legislators in the EU have woken up. Right now, there's the Digital Service Act, and before in Germany there was, for example, the Netzdg,
That's right.
which is in some ways now or it's going to be replaced by the DSA. But it was in some ways already something. And then there was GDPR, which was very narrow actually in its scope, but it was actually quite effective in what it was doing. So I think these are things where finally the societies, also EU, Europe as a big economic market, leveraged their strength, leveraged their size. But other than that, I mean, still today, even now, there's very little influence that policymaker society has on how all of these things function. And I mean, we're doing it again. Now there's AI, and we again letting it happen. Nobody's taking the driver's seat. This time there's a bit more, seems to be a bit more awareness on the regulator side, but also in civil society, also in the international community, that this is something we should be more proactively thinking about and maybe trying to at least install some safeguards. But in other ways, I mean, ChatGPT caught everybody by surprise, and it still has a massive impact. It's going to be infused into products of Microsoft, and people are gonna interact with it without fully understanding what's happening, and it will, keep driving equities in directions that we probably normatively don't want. And I think in that sense, you're right. Maybe there is this assumption that in the global north, people have more say. Maybe we could, maybe as economies, you could leverage also the political influence more, but it's not happening. And Switzerland is a very interesting case because Switzerland is always sort of trying to be very slim on regulation. So there's this general attitude here, which I don't really agree with the premise of it. There's this idea that if you regulate, you hamper innovation, which if you actually talk to people from innovation, they will tell you, well, good safeguards and good regulations are actually what you need for good innovation. No safeguards is something that the companies tell you that they want, but that is not necessarily the thing you need to have better innovation. So I think this is something where, yeah, we're in a very special place. It's a very small country. We would have a chance to be more proactive, to make our own rules, at least to fully adapt the EU rules. But what I'm seeing now, and I've been involved in some of these processes, even here, we're not even fully leveraging that. We're still
Yeah.
sort of taking the foot off the gas pedal when it comes to trying to at least counter some of the worst dynamics. And I mean, maybe we'll come to this later again, but one of the things that I see is a lot of times policymakers like to push off the responsibility to the citizen. Like, you report the hate speech. You have to, tell me when the platform is doing something wrong, which is something we are not equipped to do. We shouldn't have to do. We shouldn't have the mental load to do. And sometimes we just don't do it. Like, for example, the example of hate speech, people don't report it just for the same reasons that they don't report discrimination in the streets. They don't want to be reminded. There's big social boundaries that would have to be crossed, psychological process that work in the other direction. So I mean, this is a very cheap way of looking at this. Like, it's not our responsibility. Those are all, you are the user. This is your cell phone. You put the app on it. You're responsible for its usage. It's really short-sighted. And I think in that sense, it makes sense that actually we have just as little say as everybody else, because our regulators, our governments didn't really try to take more initiative and try to push back on our behalf.
I think you touched on a fundamental difference in attitudes across both sides of the Atlantic. The United States thinking that little to no regulation is the way forward, whereas the EU and the European states thinking fundamentally, also because of a very different history, that you do need regulation, you do need oversight, you do need ethics at the very start of those conversations. I did want to ask you, you talked quite a bit and you are involved in the broader space of debate around policy making, which is quite a privileged position to be in, and frustrating, but nevertheless quite a useful one to find yourself in. I have found that my optimism around progressive policymaking is often tempered by policymakers themselves being quite ignorant, and leading to policy making that makes the problem worse, particularly and counterintuitively in countries like Switzerland, and where I now work or with most in New Zealand, where there has traditionally been a society of high trust, decades and decades of the system working for the majority, not everybody, but for the majority. So you can tend to think that
Hmm.
it's, it really works. And now having to grapple with the kind of things that you're talking about, and policymakers having no clue at all, because to go back to something that you said, which I found very interesting, there is no individual solution to what are structural issues. The granular can't accommodate what is actually a systemic level a problem. And I wanted to ask, certainly my impression of Switzerland is a very positive one. It has a strong voice, it has a moral authority, it has soft diplomacy. But is it the case that Swiss policymakers are in tune with um, uh, things like what you talked about, algorithmic manipulation, generative AI's impact on electoral integrity, and these new challenges that are based on old fundamental issues that have gone unresolved, that in high trust societies are actually going to impact the countries to perhaps arguably a greater degree than what you would find in countries with a democratic deficit, where I think most of the academic scholarship is on around what's going on and wrong. Does that track, Carsten? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it tracks. I think the general observation is definitely correct, and I think there's interesting parallels between New Zealand and Switzerland in this regard. Similarly sized countries, sort of a little bit doing their own thing, even though Switzerland's in the middle of Europe, they're still doing their own thing. I mean, New Zealand obviously has the geographic separation, but I think, yeah, and I mean, I think you're right. So two observations that I fully agree with is that Switzerland is a high trust society still, even though it's been eroding a little. I mean, we've had a sort of far right component of the government for a long time, and I mean, this has stoked polarization. I think by now, political scientists think that Switzerland is actually one of the more polarized societies in Europe on many policy issues. But still, there's this strong fabric of we're together. There's a strong societal component. There's this strong level of long built trust between individuals and communities. So I think in that sense, it's still, and we trust the government. Like generally speaking, the levels of trust. If we ask people, I mean, I'm a political scientist, so sometimes we also ask these questions. How much do we trust the government and the working of the government we trust? And I mean, it's true. Swiss public administration is amazing. It works really, really well. Though, and now comes this component, when it comes to digitalization, there's, I think, two big issues. One is what you highlighted. There's sort of a lack of knowledge at the level of the policymakers and especially politicians. Sometimes more like the senior civil servants, they're a bit more into it, and there's certain parts of the government which are actually quite attuned. There's now at the federal level, at the highest level, there's even an agency sort of for digitalization, and those people are great. I mean, they know what they're talking about. The question is how much influence do they actually then have on these processes, and especially they don't have very much influence on the political decision making. And what we found is in the last years, there's now several waves of survey data also from politicians. There's also sort of the smart vote application, which also measures policy preferences of politicians, and digital knowledge and digital skills is going up, and the parties are paying more attention to it. But it doesn't mean that the rank and file members of the parties actually are doing that. It's certain politicians, mostly younger generation, who are pushing these and are more aware, and also like have these more complex debates around this because it's not black and white. But then the bulk of the party is still like, there's a lot of farmers and a lot of people from rural areas, which, nothing against farmers in rural areas, but which sort of come from a different generation and a different way of life, and um, they tend to not be super sensitive to these issues. Also, it's mostly older, and I think there's really a generational divide for how much people care about these issues. So I agree with this. So it's basic lack of skills on some levels, is still a pretty fundamental lack of attention. We recently, in October, we had a national parliamentary election here, and I mean, digitalization was not a topic. I even wrote an article about it for one of the IT magazines of the country, trying to analyze the policy positions on digitalization, which are actually pretty good, but it was not in the top 15, 20 topics of the party. It was not a topic. I mean, immigration was a topic, so the health insurance and things like this was a topic. Economy, as always, was a topic, but like, and this is at the time of generative AI, right? Like this was really around, like, ChatGPT being big, and all these things being going through the media, this fear of a super AI danger potentially. Like this was in the media. It was just not a policy question. It was not something that became salient. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure how this will actually ever become one, like how this will ever become a focal point of policy here, because it affects us a lot. It affects us more than we admit, but it's not a topic for the electorate. And it's definitely somehow also not a topic really for the federal government. Like here, they have pushed off some of the decisions, for example, to do more regulation around AI. They've pushed it off by a year. So there's a general, yeah, lack of attention. And I think you're right. This comes from a fundamental lack of understanding that some of these things are already here. Like complicated misinformation campaigns are already there. I'm pretty sure there are also some in Switzerland. We're just not monitoring it systematically. And similarly, that generative AI, the biases to it. There's NGOs that are pushing it. We have Algorithm Watch. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a NGO that came out of Germany, which also has a big presence now in Switzerland. They, for example, they campaigned very heavily against the Swiss Federal Rail Network, which wanted to install AI face recognition in all the public stations to do customer tracking. And I mean, this was going to happen, and they actually ran a public campaign, and now they're backed off from this plan. So there is some pushback, but this is really like a more civil society pushback. Politics was eerily quiet about this
Yeah.
generally. Like some politicians helped with the campaigns, but those are actually the usual suspects that you would anyway assume hold these views. And yeah, so I think we're in the middle of this. We're in the middle of this happening. These changes are happening. This was a very public one. I'm pretty sure there's less public things being
Yeah.
implemented
Yeah.
where there's no pushback whatsoever because people are not aware that it's happening.
So I wanted to talk about, I mean, so much that we can talk about, but one of the things that I think you hinted at was the role that platforms have on our lives today. And when I talk about platforms, just to make it clear to the listener, it's Facebook, Meta, or Twitter, or YouTube. To a lesser degree LinkedIn, but these platforms where so much of our private and professional lives sometimes intermingled to create social and political conversations that really power our countries. And the question I want was a rather specific one. When we talk about platform governance, we tend to think about the big ones, right? In Silicon Valley or coming out of the United States. But one of the things that one has seen in recent years is, particularly after Musk's acquisition of Twitter, for example, this diffusion of smaller Twitter-esque platforms, wanting to be like Twitter, but wanting to be a better version of Twitter, and also normatively not wanting to be a billionaire-funded or a billionaire, led funding model-based platform. And so it's a very interesting time to be a student of all of this. And you could argue that the diffusion leads to the democratization of conversation, and it takes away from the platform's strangled hold on societal conversations. I have always been somewhat ambivalent about this, while not discounting that and accepting the good that will come out of getting out of the big Silicon Valley giants. I've also been concerned, Carsten, about the degree to which there is even less oversight over hate, hurt, and harm over some of the platforms. The tech isn't there, the oversight isn't there. These are expenditures in human resources, and that with that diffusion also comes this mushrooming of smaller, perhaps more dangerous places and spaces for these conversations to occur. So, I mean, if you talked about policymakers, trying to get their head around the big ones, I mean, this is completely going to, confuse the hell out of them. But, as a political scientist, I'm interested in the conversations that you're looking at, particularly maybe, if you want to take a timeline after the acquisition of Twitter by Musk, around if there's anything that you're looking at that kind of speaks to the question that I posed, and what that means for you, in how you're looking at these discussions and things evolve.
Yeah, great question. So I think this is exactly the trade-off that you hinted at, which is that if we're all on the same platform, in some sense, it's a one big conversation we're in, and then you have to play by the rule of that particular platform, but we're all part of the same conversation. We're all adhering to the same standards, whatever they might be. And I mean, in principle, the reach of anybody from any part of the world into this community is there. If you now start to have this mushrooming universe of little platforms, then they're probably also going to have a more geographic focus in terms of the user base. So, like a little bit of this interesting interconnectedness, actually, one of the big innovations of the social networks goes away. The fact that you suddenly connect to people all around, right? So in that sense, that's something where you could wonder normatively, would we rather have a more inclusive, bigger platform where most people are on? And that is maybe a bit better governed, because you're right, there's resource constraints for sure, big resource constraints. I mean, especially when you're dealing with, sort of things like misinformation, hate, and so on, you actually need big teams. And we are not there yet that you can automatize it. If you do automatize things, you still need a lot of oversight. And I mean, so lots of the smaller platforms start with nothing. And I mean, right now, the regulation is really also, a lot of the rules only apply for these very large online platforms. So
VLOPs,
even
they're called, right?
exactly VLOPs,
Yeah.
even from a regulatory point of view, the small ones don't have to adhere to the same things. They might want to try, but there is no pressure to do so. And I think, speaking as an academic, we see sort of two dangers. One is, if you have these platforms, you have exactly this. You have segregation also of conversations and of populations into these platforms. And I mean, Truth Social is one big example in the US, where people who think alike then all go there, and then they get even more isolated from other opinions. Doesn't have to we don't have to take a stance on whether this is what are the right opinions, but like, you're basically just talking to like-minded people. And this might be the same on other platforms, like Blue Sky came out as a Twitter alternative, right? But then who migrated there is probably not a reflection of the general population that was on Twitter. So also there, you're going to end up in a more narrow information environment, where the things you hear about, the people you interact with, are more similar to you probably than they were before on Twitter. And I think there's a lot of research that shows that this is, on average, probably not a good thing. Like, we have these findings that what these platforms do, and this doesn't matter which ones, YouTube, even the search engines, Google, and so forth, they sort of have this, what we call the accidental exposure component. So they do show you things that you would not otherwise look for yourself. And those tend to be more diverse and more interesting than the things that you go and look out for yourself. And I think that's a big role of these platforms. Sure, they also give you a lot of content that is like the one that you want, but they also mix in other content from your network, or even from outside the network, that you would not otherwise be exposed to. And I think this goes away as you have more narrow and more different platforms that are more also for specific audiences. You lose that component. I think, I mean, from a regulatory point of view, of course, it's also going to be much harder to regulate the whole universe of these smaller platforms than trying to, control the couple of dozen big ones that exist, if you count sort of also all the shopping, big shopping platforms and so on. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting time. I mean, there's people who really study sort of the switching behavior from one platform to the next, but so far none of the competitors has really
Yeah.
been able to grow, right? So in US,
Yeah.
True Social maybe is one where it has been successful in a particular target group, but outside of that, none of the other platforms. TikTok, but this was a completely new medium, and there's no competitor sort of in the video platform
Yeah.
market right now that could be anywhere close. So there's people who
Well,
would
it's
argue that there's only a place for one big platform for
yeah.
every sort of kind of interaction. So maybe that's also true.
Well, let's see where Threads goes now that it's in Europe as well. Early days yet as we record this, but that might be one answer to that question that you posed. I did want to talk about, also because you raised it and wanted to talk about it, algorithmic impacts on society. And I wanted to approach that in the practice of what you do and what I do, actually, which is the frustration now increasingly of the inability to determine what exactly is going on in these platforms. Facebook had CrowdTangle, but it's not invested in that. Twitter, some ridiculous amount of money now you had to invest to just get what you could before Musk, as academics, to the public API. And all of these platforms have so much data that the accountability that comes through the sunlight of scrutiny from independent eyes like yourself, Carsten, is either impossible or now increasingly expensive and thus very hard to do. So you have that going on. And you also have, as you yourself brought up, generative AI plus algorithmic advancements as well. I know that the Christchurch call, has this as one of its central thematic areas and interests. I know that the New Zealand Special Envoy and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, is very interested in all of this. But again, we seem to be living in an interesting time where all of these things are happening at the same time. Companies are closing down while telling the public that they are doing things and to please trust them. But at the same time, there's also advancements around algorithmic presentations, which is actually front and center of what you do with news media and the public conversation. So, where do you see all of that going, Carsten, given what you're looking at today?
It's going nowhere good. I mean, that's for sure. I mean,
Well,
so
I hope for a
it
more
was.
optimistic answer.
I'm sorry, I'm not very optimistic at this moment. I mean, for the simple reason that when we still had access to Twitter, we could study some things, but we were still sort of scratching the surface. Sure, we had access to the API, we could, look at the tweets, but we had no idea how the algorithms worked underneath. And actually, shortly before Musk took over, Twitter had this initiative to make some of the code base available, and it was enlightening to see how simplistic some of the things that were built into that were actually working, and how complicated other things were. And like, people, programmers actually, for the layperson, started disentangling, how does it actually work, how does this amplification of these algorithms is implemented in practice. And I mean, there's obvious then red flags how some of these things work. I think it was even in the beginning when Musk had taken over, there was like, they found like sort of the Musk factor, like everything that he wrote had to be promoted on Twitter.
Boost.
So things like this, where there's this very simple way of manipulating what people see, which you can just code into the code base. So I think we need more accountability like that, but right now it's not going that way. Like you said, platforms are shutting it down. Already, Facebook was a pretty closed universe. CrowdTangle was always only we had access, we still have access to CrowdTangle as much as it gives. Very closed access when it comes to the more individual level private data, which to some degree makes sense for data protection, but which was anyway only allowing us to study public sites and sort of aggregate engagement metrics, which doesn't actually let you study the algorithmic part. So what people did and do is they do auditing studies, but auditing studies is sort of the least worst way of doing this. You observe the behavior of the platform, you make inferences about what it does when you trigger it in certain ways systematically. It just tells you sort of at the surface, if I ask for this, that's what it gives me. If I ask for that, that's what it gives me. But it doesn't really tell you the mechanism, doesn't tell you how it's implemented on the inside. You can make guesses of how it works and which factors matter, but it's very hard to reconstruct. I think we need a fundamental rethinking of this, in the sense that the DSA, for example, in Europe is now requiring more transparency, but it's still sort of self-reported. We actually need ways for external auditors, especially scientists, or maybe also NGOs working in this domain, to go in, get access to this data while preserving privacy. There's ways to do that. You could do it on site. You can sign NDAs and things like this. But then to have independent research that really studies what's going on. And I mean, there was now one big such endeavor, which was not fully independent, which was around the 2020 US presidential election. Meta actually put a big project up, which had academics from the outside, US academics, and also their own people from the data science side, and they ran this election study, and it's actually a great piece of social science research, but it's still sort of under the umbrella of Meta. They And this was hard fought for. I know some people who were on the inside. They actually agreed to publish anything that comes out of it, regardless of what comes out of it, which is great. This is sort of the minimum we would require as a scientist, but this is a big ask from a company. So
Yeah.
that they did. But I mean, there's many ways in which, if the company is still involved, the results are changing. So I think if we really want to know what's going on with these platforms, we need a much more drastic level of transparency and access. And you could do that. And I think the EU mechanisms that are now in place through the DSA, which is that you can ask for data access, they are not going to be the solution. It's too slow, too much leverage for the companies to say no. So I think that's something that truly frustrates me. This has this fundamental impact, but we as scientists can't really even inform policy and society because we can't we know how to ask the question, we just can't test them. There's so
Yeah.
many things that I would like to know, where I'm pretty sure the data scientists inside the companies already have the answers, but we don't know. And
Yeah.
some of this might actually be innocent. It might be innocuous things where we shouldn't worry about, and other things we should probably worry about that we don't know of. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a weird time. It's a weird time. There's so much progress, like you said. Generative AI is unclear how much it's going to exacerbate existing problems. It likely is. So if the production of misinformation has been turbo boosted, but we don't know if it's fundamentally going to change the way that people are informed
Yeah.
about the real world. So I think, and we have no way of really studying. Like, we don't have access to Twitter anymore. Like, a lot of the studies I've done, they're impossible today, which were possible like a year ago.
My PhD is impossible today, and that's just like just a couple of years. I mean, I did it at the last period of time where you could do it in the way that I did, and that's so sad. And
Yeah,
that's so sad. It's
very
really,
sad.
really
It's
sad.
yeah.
I would love to have made that methodology available for others in my country and my region, and that's why I did what I did. I mean, I kind of thought about that consciously. I used only ways that were replicable, and
Mhm.
weren't costing a lot of money, so that the approach could also be instructive. But you can't do it. You just can't. And it's so sad. I did want to kind of as we get closer to wrapping up, there were two broad questions that I wanted to ask. One of which I've now forgotten, but I'll go with the one that I do remember. And when I simplistically and at great violence to nuance look at what I do today, kind of linked to what I said, it is very different after COVID 19 to what it was prior to COVID 19. And there has been a definite mark on our digital discourse online, including social media, that COVID 19 had, and for obvious reasons, we were all at home, we were all communicating through, these intermediaries and, mediated through these big platforms. And I think the worst and the best of us kind of morphed and grew into what we have today, which are these structures and ways of communicating and engaging and platforms and spaces that are not the same as they were prior to COVID 19. You do so much of work on hate speech and dangerous speech, and determining the nature and degree to which media reportage is a symbiotic relationship with how society sees itself. Would you agree with that, gut feeling that I have, which actually is not a gut feeling, but is also, located in what I do elsewhere? But I want to know whether that tracks with you and what you do over there. And if so, what stands out for you in what you do and how you do it, comparing the pre-COVID 19 world to what you do today?
That's a tricky question. So I think qualitatively, and sort of not having my academic hat on, I agree with you that that's the general impression. Like, there is some shift. There's some shift, sort of also in the netiquette. Let's put it that way. That is being used, and I mean, yeah, there has been a lot of changes because we were all online so much and working from home so much that are now staying, right? Some of them good, like you said, some of them probably not as good. It's much harder to pinpoint this. We've tried this. I had a master student, for example, look at this sort of the level of nastiness before, during, and after COVID, and that's not so clear patterns. There's some clear spikes. For example, in Switzerland were around the measures, even though Switzerland had relatively moderate measures during COVID. There was definitely some peaks in public discourse and also very negative general conversations happening. But did it really drive the level of hate? I mean, we don't really have reliable evidence for that. We rather see that hate is relatively constant. There's a constant flow of a few percent of all online posts which are hateful. And they do spike, but the spikes are not like, from 3 to 10%. It's maybe from 3 to 4 or so. It's visible, but it's not that huge. And what's a bit more striking, though, is that sort of the targets of who gets targeted by hate has maybe shifted. It was a lot foreigners, women. It's now during COVID, it became much more also politicians, which is a bit worrisome. Also in what we talked about, high trust societies, uh, which is a sign of the general polarization of society. But like, I'm not sure which direction the causal relationship is pointing there. Is it because generally as society everything is becoming polarized, so then also the conversations online become more nasty and people are actually using outright hate speech? Insults is one thing, undesirable, but like outright hate speech against the other group, um, that is a shift that you see, sort of more who's it against. And I mean, I have a hard time disentangling this, and I think this is the general problem worldwide, right? With all the polarization going on and the way that issues are politicized, and also the flaring up of these old tensions, like we're going back to sort of Cold War oppositions, big political camps forming. You see a general tendency that there's more nastiness towards the outgroups, more nastiness towards the smaller groups, more going back on simple dimensions, national dimensions, going away from a lot of the things that we actually achieved in the last decades in terms of trying to be a more inclusive society. At least online, I think a lot of the conversations are not as inclusive anymore. But is it like, what's driving it? I think that's something we haven't put our finger on. I would say it's probably a mix. It's a mix of the general tendency, and then plus it's happening that the online platforms are also not helping in that regard. And I'm pretty sure that this is the spiral that we're seeing is rather going to accelerate. And I think that it goes back to the previous topic we talked about. And now if you push people onto specific platforms, or especially you push them off the platforms, and you go to things like Telegram, which is sort of a weird in between, right? Like as a messenger, not really a platform, and then there's groups which are, deep in one direction, full of hate and full of misinformation, and this we can't even study unless we know which groups these are, and we're in them. We can't even know what's being said. We just
Yeah.
maybe know about it. So I think that's the real challenge now. Yeah.
I wanted to ask the final question, which I think, you know, I hope you can compress your answer, because even as I'm asking it, I kind of know in which direction you'll go in. One of the concerns Carsten and I have is that the world we are living in is erasing the even interest of people knowing what's true. Academics would call this an epistemic erosion. You lose meaning. Um, you lose all meaning. So it doesn't even matter what the answer to the question is, whether it's true or not. Yeah, you cease to ask the question: is it true? And to be honest, that really frightens me. As individuals who don't have a handle on a capital T truth, but believe in certain shared realities. The Earth is round. We landed on the moon. There is such a thing as COVID-19. Vaccines help save lives. There are things that I think liberal democracies are founded upon. Otherwise, we just splinter. And I fear that what is at a meta level happening is that, without getting too technical, in ways that you and I can go into, just to keep it broad, I think that we are bearing witness to a very sobering world where meaning itself is being attacked. And by the way, in countries like India, for example, the world's largest democracy, this is a consequential year, and a lot of people are talking about Biden and the United States. But a lot of what actually is a harbinger of what the West is going to encounter is happening in India under PM Modi and what is happening with the electoral cycle over there.
Yes,
So I
absolutely.
mean, and so as a final question, if you believe that thesis to hold somewhat true, what does your research and work suggest are ways we can address that? And I'll leave it open. I mean, we can, as a father, as a citizen, as a caregiver, as a parent, as a politician or policymaker or academic, um, you know, is there anything that can be done, and what does your practice suggest can be done?
It's a tough question to finish with, but so I think first we have to understand where does it come from, right? And I think we're still struggling with why are we in this way? Why is there this epistemological, change? Why don't we care about truth anymore? And one of the explanations I like most is that it's a reaction actually to the complexities of the world, and in two ways. One is at the individual level. It's the truth is very complicated now. I mean, so many things like climate change, COVID, also things like this. It's not straight cut answers, right? It's not black and white, and then the interaction of them is even more complicated. So most people, and I catch myself in the same way, we want to reduce the complexities, right? And then sometimes going away from the truth helps with that. Or somebody offers a simpler explanation that is not true, that's more easy to expect. So I think that's the one side. That's sort of the individual level aspect. And then, I mean, the other thing is actually that's something that's historically recurrent is politicians every once in a while learn that it's actually easier to just tell untruth and campaign on those than trying to face the complicated truth. And we've had this before in the past, long in the past, maybe like 100 years ago. And I think that's the second component. So one is it's anyway a tendency. The world is really complicated. And then on top of it, politicians are using it. It's fascinating. Not so long ago, I read books around the time of the rise of the Nazi Party, and I mean the way people look at the world there in the books is very similar to the way that people look at the world now. And they were facing a lot of the same things. I mean, technology was different, but like sort of this, the world is becoming really complex. There's no easy answers. We have all these big challenges. And on the other hand, there is these people who are telling simple truth about the world. So I think we have to be, I mean, that's just a broad comparison. I'm not the only one making it. There's also historians pushing this. We have to be very careful because it's a very slippery slope. So I think that's my diagnosis. A bit longer probably than you wanted, but I think that's important to make this point because then the solution really depends on this. And in my work, what we found is it's really hard then to offer solution in this regard. So we've, for example, experimented around with giving people more diverse information on topics, and we found this has like very limited effect because if they don't want to have that information, there's actually very strong psychological mechanisms to just ignore them, and actually more than one mechanism does that for you. And so that's not really the solution, right? Like instead of having one set of political news, you just give them a political news across the spectrum. People don't want. I mean, honestly, I don't necessarily want it. I don't want to read all that other things from the other side of the spectrum necessarily. So that's sort of out. And then I think the most promising thing I've seen is to raise awareness for the fact that this is being instrumentalized, that you can't necessarily trust what you hear. But this has the fundamental disadvantage that then people actually lose trust in information altogether. And I mean, some of the misinformation interventions, the ways that also NGOs or activists trying to solve the misinformation problem actually erodes trust in media and trust in information altogether. So as with all these things we've discussed today, there's no simple answers. I try to myself, and I guess also as a parent, I'll try to infuse this in my kids to understand the complexity, to honor it, like the world is complex, and not to fall for the easy solutions, but to accept sort of that some things are complicated and we might not have answers straight away. And I think this immunizes you a little bit against this, and you're still looking for the truth, which I think is the most important innovation at all, that we are like sort of have this science fact-led way of approaching the world. And we could also go back to the old ideologies where, you know, you have a god, whoever that might be, and just follow whatever the commandments are. I think it's great that we reflect and we update information. And during COVID, this was fascinating to watch in real time as a scientist, that we didn't know much, then we knew more, and information kept changing. It was never wrong because it was always what we knew at that time. And then in retrospect, certain things, of course, are not correct, or we didn't fully understand it then, but that's how it works, right? And I think maybe that's something that's more difficult to grasp for people who are not working in the sciences and not doing this as their everyday job, that this level of uncertainty, that sometimes information has to change, is part of it, right? Because we have to understand things first, and as we're understanding them, we're updating what we know about the world. And I think maybe if we, as one thing, if we could make this as a broader societal mission, that, you know, simple answers usually are wrong, complicated answers are usually right, and maybe having a little patience of you know, also trying things and letting things play out here and there might be helpful. Yeah, but it's not a good answer in the sense of I wouldn't be able to sell this to a policymaker tomorrow.
And that's I suppose the subject for another podcast. But you know, it as you were talking in this past hour, it did occur to me that one of the highest compliments I can give you, and with regards to policymakers not understanding, is that you're such a wonderful science communicator, and that you know you communicate complexity in a way that is both engaging but doesn't give simplistic answers, which I think is such, you know, which is what science is, you know, at its heart. And it's so nice to kind of spend this hour with you, Carsten. Thank you again for joining the foundation and I. We've covered a lot of terrain. There's so much more we can cover. You know, my mind is bursting with these questions and conversations we could be having, but I'm sure there'll be an opportunity in the future to do so. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the nice compliment. I think you're right. We have to be able to talk and actually say these things more for everybody to partake in the process. Because one thing I really don't like is sort of this ivory tower thinking, and that the scientist knows what to do. We don't either, and I think maybe that's good to communicate. We're trying to systematically understand the world, but we're grappling with the same issues that everybody else is.
Thanks, Carsten.
Thanks so much for having me.